first order of business is who are the people that I owe blow pops to? The folks that last time. Okay. Okay, Riley. Oh, almost too far away. Yeah, but it's a challenge, right? Oh, all right. No, if you didn't catch it, you don't get to keep it. Who else? Who are the other folks last time? Okay. Well, all right. Snooze you lose. Austin, I hear you have a joke that no, I won't build it up. I told okay. Yeah, nice and loud and take it slow.
What do you call a cheap circumcision?
I don't know. What do you call a cheap circumcision?
A ripoff.
Okay, that's pretty good. Definitely wince inducing. So we almost finished a chapter about sexual behavior, but I thought of two things that we didn't get to. Number one, I meant to tell you that the missionary position is well named, is in fact well suited for getting pregnant. When people are trying to get pregnant, often it's advised not only that they use the missionary position with the woman on her back, but also that after ejaculation, that she lies still for a while thereafter, or even tilt her hips up to sort of facilitate the flow of sperm to the cervix. And then the last topic I want to talk about is in paraplegia, where this is a neuroscience class, where sometimes when the spinal cord becomes disconnected somewhere between the lumbar region and the brain, what that means is that the person will have no sensation below a certain point in the body, depending on where the spinal break is, and will have no motor control in that region. And of course, the paraplegia is sadly common. Mostly it happens in young men because it's usually young men who are doing things like diving into pools that are more shallow than they think, riding motorcycles, things like that. And but it doesn't mean that they don't have a sexual life. Number one, if they eventually get married and want to have children, there are methods of harvesting sperm from the gentleman so that his wife can use artificial insemination, that doctors can use artificial insemination to make the wife pregnant. And of course, there's nothing to keep him from pleasing his wife, even if he doesn't have access to an erection, et cetera. And all of that you probably could have surmised. But it's also true that at least some men with paraplegia afterwards become more sexual in those parts of the body that they can still feel, the upper part of the body. And some of those men tell us they can even reach an orgasm by having their preferred partner stimulate them, et cetera. So if they, and I should say that even if they can't have an erection from thinking about erotic thoughts, et cetera, it's sometimes possible to elicit an erection simply by stimulating the penis. And so it also sometimes happens that a couple will use that method to get an erection, have the woman slip it inside her vagina, and then stimulate enough to cause an ejaculation to happen. Or, for that matter, one way to harvest sperm from such men is for someone, presumably a partner, to stimulate the penis and achieve an ejaculation. There will be no orgasm accompanying it, right? Because there's no connection between the spinal centers where the orgasm signal is generated, which is actually an upper lumbar region, and the brain. Questions about any of that so far? Okay, well, I think that ends chapter 7 about sexual behavior, unless someone else has a question, anything in that chapter. Okay, well, let's have a Kahoot then. So now we're going to talk about fertility and childbirth. And there are several things that we'll address, some of which I talk about there, about the stages of pregnancy, what makes pregnancy more likely, what makes pregnancy more likely to be successful, i.e. with a healthy baby at the end. It is a little bit, you know, like this for me. First, we've talked several times about pregnancy tests that are incredibly reliable and is a thing that's changed just in my lifetime. And the basis of the pregnancy test is the detection of a protein that is only produced by embryos. And that protein is human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, which we noted before. So the role of HCG normally, it's a gene that you express once in your life, but you're not expressing it right now. And you expressed it as an embryo in order to prolong the life of the corpus luteum so that it would continue to produce progesterone to keep the endometrium of the uterus in a favorable condition, i.e. to put off menstruation until the embryo has a chance to implant and then will eventually start making its own gonadotropins. So if in your blood or urine, if there's some HCG there, that tells you there's an embryo somewhere in the body that's secreting the HCG. And the way the tests work is they have the woman pee on the one end of the stick. Typically, they like to wait for the first morning urination because there'll be the most accumulation of any other proteins there. So you have the highest chance of it working. But, that doesn't mean that's the only time it work. And there's an absorbent tissue there, absorbent stuff, not tissue, that causes the urine to wick up. And it will rely on a series of things that have been embedded there. One is mouse antibodies to HCG. So this is an antibody generated from a mouse, typically a monoclonal antibody, if you know what that means, because you can make it in huge quantities and it's always the same. And it's been manufactured to recognize HCG, but it's also has bound to it an enzyme. Then if this is the HCG, once these mouse antibodies have bound to the HCG, they're continuing to flow up the strip along with the urine, and embedded there in the strip are other antibodies, right? That are here it is. Okay, hold on. The other antibody that matters is an antibody generated in a goat that recognizes any mouse antibody. And in between, in the test region, some of those those mouse antibodies that have found HCG are now being bound to HCG, that it's embedded there. And now the reaction product that's bound to these first set of antibodies can leave a colored reaction product. And as it's pulled down, even if there's no HCG there, if you want to know that the system's working, then those antibodies that never found HCG are going to be bound by the goat anti-mouse antibody. And so the importance of the control region is if it lights up, then that tells you that the urine was there and the urine indeed got up to where the test results would matter. And that means that if you see a line here, it means that there's HCG present. If you don't see a line here, then it means there's no HCG present if the test worked, which you know by the control region. So if neither line is marked, then you don't know that the test worked. You need to try it again. But presuming that the control region is showing up, then had there been any HCG there, it should have left the other line. And as it says there, it's incredibly sensitive and incredibly early. So it can detect HCG even if it's just the first day after a missed period. How's that? So someone who has very regular periods where they know for sure that normally it would start on this particular day, taking a test that particular day doesn't matter, but the next day might detect HCG. And as with all of these things, of course, there's always a false positive rate, and it's incredibly low. And there's also the chance of a miss. That is, the HCG is there and the test didn't pick it up yet. But if you wait a few days and take the test, and again, the HCG isn't there, then you can be pretty sure there's no embryo. How's that? Yeah. And now that, it's the same test, but then they have microprocessors look for the lines and then give you a nice digital response, but it's always the same. And one of the reasons why it might be good to know if there's any HCG there is that sometimes the embryo may get stuck somewhere between the ovary and the uterus. And if an embryo embeds in the oviduct, and there's no problem at first, but as it starts to grow, it can eventually cause the oviduct to rupture, and that may also then rupture blood vessels, and therefore the woman may suddenly have a lot of internal bleeding that she might not recognize. So ectopic pregnancy is a life-threatening event, and also sometimes known as a tubal pregnancy. Sometimes the ectopic pregnancy isn't in the tube, but maybe somewhere else in endometrium outside the uterus. And in those cases, the embryo is doomed. It cannot survive, but there's also a chance that it will rupture blood vessels and cause problems. So here are it turns out that one of the indicators of a tubal pregnancy is referred pain. So there's no pain receptors in the oviduct itself, but your body is such that damage to the oviduct may cause what's known as referred pain, where it's not where your sensation is that it's your shoulders that are hurting. Likewise, damage to the gallbladder sometimes is accompanied by pain in the shoulders. So those are the sorts of things that you should be looking for. And as I said, it's a life-threatening event. So if you suspect there might be an ectopic pregnancy, which can only be possible, of course, if you've been ovulating and you've had sex, if you think there's a chance of an ectopic pregnancy, first, the urine test would give you some idea of whether there's an embryo there, and it's probably a good idea to go to emergency room right away. Not something where you wait and call your doctor and find out. Okay? Questions about that? How many people know someone who has had an ectopic pregnancy? Me too. Yeah, it's not that uncommon. It isn't always life-threatening, but it can be life-threatening, and so you have to treat it as such. Questions? Okay. So here's one of the things that's most difficult for a lot of people to accept. This is a very interesting chart where it shows here is the day of ovulation, which is the highest probability of getting pregnant, of having a conception, if you gather sperm on that day. Okay. And the important thing is the next day, you can go ahead and gather sperm, but there isn't going to be a successful pregnancy because why? So conception will take place, technically speaking, the graph's wrong, but no pregnancy is going to happen in the long run. Why? The egg just came out Tuesday, and the woman gathered sperm Wednesday, and there's not going to be a pregnancy Yeah, Ariana. Yes, exactly. If 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 she ovulated Tuesday, by the time she gathers the sperm, the the egg is already in the uterus, and if it gets fertilized there, it won't develop fast enough in order to implant. So a conceptus will happen, but no pregnancy. Everyone get that? And that means that, well, and that'll be important for several things. So if you're trying to maximize your chance of getting pregnant, one of the things you do is try to predict when your ovulation is going to take place, right? And there's no sure way to do it. And the best chance of being able to predict when your ovulation take place is if you're one of those women who have very regular periods, whether it's a 27-day cycle, 28-day cycle, et cetera. But you've been keeping track of it on a calendar and you know you're like clockwork, right? That will happen that way. By the way, for most women, that's not the case. But in whether it is that way or not, what people have looked for are changes in body temperature. Because it turns out that on the day of ovulation, we say typically you'd expect it to be around the 14th day since the menses, that there's a dip in body temperature. And so if that morning, and when people are advised to do this, they suggest that women take their temperature first thing in the morning before they've gotten out of bed, had any activity, et cetera, and establish a baseline about what is their body temperature. And you have to have a very accurate thermometer, which these days is relatively easy. In the old days, you had to buy a special thermometer that had lots of gradations in it. Anyway, and keep careful track of body temperature. And in a few cycles, you'll probably understand when in your cycle ovulation tends to take place if you routinely see a dip one time in the cycle. And that means in the future, you can anticipate when that dip might happen and gather sperm before and on the day of ovulation. So if the woman has taken her body temperature and it's quite a bit lower than it was yesterday, and she has reason to believe from the past that this is likely to be the nadir of her body temperature, that's when it's important for her partner to come put some sperm in there as fast, as quickly as possible. If she waits till the next day, there might be a conception, but she won't have a successful pregnancy. Oh, I've never heard an explanation for why this happened. It's just oh, maybe, I like the thinking because since the testes have to be a little bit below body temperature in order for spermatogenesis to happen, that maybe that's important for sperm motility or something. As far as I know, that's not the case. As far as I know, it's the lowered body temperature is needed to make the sperm, but once they're made, and most especially once they've left the epididymis, been mixed with the other juices that are going to be in there and get inside the uterus, the vagina, and first the uterus. As far as I know, they're perfectly willing to happen at a wide range of body temperatures because, of course, natural selection would select that. Oh, great question. There's a technical term for people who rely on ovulation monitoring for birth control. They're called mommies and daddies. It's not effective. That's an old joke for the rhythm method, which we'll get to in a moment. It's not effective for a couple of reasons. Number one is if you saw the dip today and don't see it tomorrow, maybe you ovulated today, but maybe you're going to see another dip the next day. Questions, all good questions. So why the woman's body has a dip in body temperature on the day of ovulation? I've never heard anyone offer an explanation for that. It was just an empirical finding. And these days, that's like the first in a long line of steps you can take to try to increase the chance of getting pregnant. So these days, with better blood tests for luteinizing hormone, the other thing that you can do with the help of a physician is monitor blood levels of LH. And there typically is a surge in LH about a day and a half before ovulation takes place. So that's another method that's a little more invasive, but is also a little more, on the one hand, if you don't mind giving a blood sample, it's maybe more convenient than keeping a log of what your body temperature is every morning before you get out of bed to pee. And so that's another thing that's used sometimes. We'll talk about other methods in a bit. The other idea is that it's probably not a good idea for the couple to have sex every day. It seems like, for one thing, every time a man ejaculates, the more he's ejaculated recently, the smaller the volume of the ejaculate will be today. And so the idea is that he should not ejaculate every day if he's trying to maximize the chance of pregnancy on the day that they think ovulation might be taking place, because the volume of the ejaculate has an influence on fertility. So the advice typically is to try to have sex every other day, but of course to concentrate it around the time that ovulation is going to be taking place. And the more um, the more you know about when ovulation might take place, the better your chances are. As I said earlier, the missionary position with the man above seems to be more effective at getting pregnant, and they might suggest that the woman remain on her back for 30 minutes or so to try to keep track of, to try to encourage sperm to get through the cervix and up the uterus and to the oviduct. Another method that works for some women in terms of knowing when their ovulation is going to take place is to keep track of vaginal mucus. So for some women, there is a change in the texture and the consistency of vaginal mucus across the ovulatory cycle. So it tends to be clear and slippery, and you can, using your fingers to gather some mucus from the vagina, then you pull the fingers apart slowly, and you look for the quality of the thread that forms. So it turns out that on the day that ovulation ends, right? Sorry, for a couple of days before ovulation, then it gets especially thin for some women. And if it's thick, and because it's thin, you can stretch it out quite a bit before it breaks. Whereas if it's thick and never thins out, maybe ovulation hasn't taken place. And so if you think you might want to be pregnant someday, and you might think about trying to monitor this. If you're not on the birth control pill, you might, if you're cycling normally, spontaneously, you might consider looking to see whether you can detect that change about 14 days after the end of the previous menses. 14 days after the beginning of the previous menses. Questions about that? On the one hand, not terribly accurate. On the other hand, totally non-invasive and totally safe. And you know, maybe so. We've mentioned several times that the statistics for both men and women, the rate of infertility has historically been about 10%. We'll see in a moment that there's reason to think that for men at least, fertility may be going down even more than that. So if each partner has a 10% chance of being infertile, if you do the math, it turns out that that means about 15% of couples will have difficulty, bless you, in getting pregnant. So it's, not uncommon for couples who want to get pregnant to not have an easy time doing it. About a quarter percent of the time, the problem is that the man isn't making enough sperm. And That's a factor that can be easily tested. That's the good news. Non-invasive testing. Just have the man masturbate into a cup to provide a sperm sample, and then microscope analysis can tell you lots of things about the sperm quality that can give you some idea of fertility. I'll tell you what those qualities are in a slide or two. Ah, yeah. So let's see. No, I don't think there's any evidence that masturbation affects sperm count. But I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier. Um, the more ejaculations a man has within a certain amount of time, the smaller the volume of the ejaculate each time. But as far as I know, it won't affect the density of sperm in that ejaculate. So again, if you're trying to get someone, if you and your partner are trying to get pregnant, you want to maximize the ejaculate volume. And of course, higher volume will also mean there's more sperm in there, right? So at any one time. Another thing that can cause low sperm quality is if there's an undescended testis, especially if both testes are undescended. But the odds are, if that's the case, that it's been addressed medically. Sometimes one testis remains undescended and the man might not notice, or he and his doctor might decide to not do anything about it. Um, the other thing that can happen are things that cause the temperature of the scrotum to be higher than it might normally be. And you wouldn't think so, but this isn't a joke. Tight underwear and tight pants, like bicycle pants and things like that, can raise the temperature in the scrotum and can interfere with sperm manufacture. And there's great concern that in a world that's been part of a chemical revolution for over a century now, the number of synthetic molecules that have gotten made through for industry, that inevitably a percentage of them end up in the environment. There's concern that there might be environmental toxins that can interfere with sperm production. And as we'll see in a moment, the fact that sperm quality has been declining for some years now certainly fits with that idea. And yeah, questions about that? So when they look at a microscope sample, what do they look for in semen? First of all, one of the things they want to know is what's the volume of the ejaculate, because that can make a difference. And if really it's less than a millimeter of volume, so I guess that would come to just a proportion of a teaspoon, that's not a good sign. And it's probably just physically the delivery of enough volume to the area of the cervix that's there are enough sperm that have a chance of swimming through the cervical opening and getting to the egg. The easiest thing to understand is the sperm count. Some ejaculate has a lot more sperm per unit volume than others. And if there's less than 13 million per mil, so if it's 5 mils, that means each ejaculate has about 60, 70 million sperm. You can't say the guy isn't trying, right? Make that many at once. But if there's less than 13 million per mil, that reduces the odds quite a bit. You also look for sperm that have abnormal morphology, and every sperm sample has some sperm that clearly aren't going to work. They're not moving or they're malformed. I'll show you some examples in a moment. And then the last thing that you might not have thought of is if you're very careful to put the semen sample in a very controlled um, fluid where you've controlled lots of other factors, you can ask how active they are. How much wiggling around are they doing? And remember, they only start wiggling around once they get mixed with the other features at the base of the penis before ejaculation. So you look for what percentage of them are moving normally. So, oh, sorry, didn't. No, no, it's not that. It's this. Yeah. So, oh, where are they? So here are what abnormal spermatozoa. Sometimes they have more than one tail, and that interferes with them moving around properly. And Here's the data I talked about before. This comes from France, but people have documented this in lots of other populations as well. As far as I know, it's only in the Western nations that people have been keeping track of this, where in this case, they were able to get a hold of a bunch of samples that had all been taken from men who were 35 years old at the time that they provided the sample, and they happened to all be in France. And you can see, notice that the scale is a little bit deceptive, right? So it doesn't start at 0, but still, the fact that there were 75 million spermatozoa per mil, which is very different. But if you go back here, right, that's the high, that's, over 48 million is the optimal. Anyway, that they went from 75 million per mil to 50 million. So that's a decrease of about a third. And it's across a huge population. Well, what could be responsible for that? It seems very unlikely it's got anything to do with genes, right? There's been no significant change in the gene pool in a mere, what we're talking about here, in a mere 30 years. So it's probably something in the environment that's changing the quality and the amount of sperm that men are making. Questions about that? No chance of humanity going extinct from this process, right? Because a long way to go to none. And these days, the big revolution that's happened is in terms of in vitro fertilization, or IVF. So I'm going to ask something, and I'm going to ask you something, and if you'd rather not say, that's fine. Don't raise your hands. But how many people here happen to know that you're here as a result of IVF? Odds are some people are, and it's okay if you don't want to self-identify. And some of you may be here through IVF, but your parents haven't mentioned it to you. But so, ask your folks if they needed a little bit of help and what help they got, et cetera. So in vitro, yeah, Brian. Uh-huh. Ah. Well, I mean, what has been seen, first of all, there's several reasons why pregnancy might fail. Sometimes it is, well, and I should point out that for most women, the first time they're pregnant, it doesn't come to term. So it's not unusual for a woman the first time her body is presented with an embryo for it not to be carried successfully to term. And it seems pretty clear that that a woman's that the first time. So another way of saying that is lots of women have miscarriages the first couple of times they get pregnant, and even more women have miscarriages and they're not aware that they had a miscarriage because it happens early enough that the menses isn't late enough to get their attention. So number one, it could be that just going through the process of having a successful pregnancy made her body more tolerant of future pregnancies. The other thing you have to think about is whether the fertility drugs, we'll talk about it in a moment, that are typically used, whether they kind of kick-started the ovulatory cycle in a way that I got to stop talking about your mom. But but so those are all things that can go on. So in vitro fertilization means the fertilization, the meeting of the sperm and the egg happens in glass. That's what in vitro means in Latin. And so for this to happen, first the physicians involved have to gather as many eggs as they can from the would-be mother. And to do that, they will give her fertility drugs that will end up having more than one follicle ripen and start to make mature eggs. So they're going to try to have lots of eggs present, and then we'll laparoscopically go in and look for the swollen follicles, harvest them, again, laparoscopically, and gather as many eggs as they can. And I think it's not unusual for them to, to gather 8 or 9 or 10, something like that, eggs at a time. And that's good because you want to maximize the chance that one of them will be successful. And they can keep the eggs healthy and happy in an in vitro environment with the fluids that have been worked out. They might sometimes use ultrasound to help with that harvest. These days, they also, not unusually, can optically see where the follicles are. So they gather up the eggs and put them, keep them in a tube, and then gather sperm from the would-be father. And they've now worked out what sort of fluid environment increases the chances that a sperm will get to and fertilize an egg. And typically, when things are successful, there'll be several embryos that will result. And they'll know that the embryos have happened because they start dividing. So they look for tiny embryos, 4 to 8 to 16 cell stage, and gather them, keep them separate, and will eventually put them back in the mother, into the uterus at a stage where they're likely to implant. Questions about that so far? Typically, they gather, and they may or may not use hormones to treat the woman when they implant the embryos in order to maintain the uterine lining, et cetera. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mhm. Yep. Absolutely. So what I was going to say is this tends to be expensive. And for most couples, I think it's probably closer to $20,000 per cycle now. For most couples, they can't afford to try it very many times. Number one, this means that the couples are highly motivated for it to work, right? Because if they're willing to shell out $20,000, that means they really, really want a baby, right? So tell your sister she was really wanted. That's the one thing I know for sure. And but it also means that you might only have one shot that you can afford. And so the advice is to implant more than one embryo because there's no guarantee that all of them will implant. And so it's not at all uncommon for people having IVF babies to have 2 or even more babes. So in the previous time I taught this class, I had one individual who was part of triplets, different sexes. So they were fraternal twins, triplets, not identical. And that's why that happens. Questions about that? And so that's another roll of the dice. For most of the parents, if they end up with more than one kid at a time, especially if they think this is their only chance to have any kids at all, for most parents, that's a bonus. That's a feature, not a bug, right? Questions about that? I'll come back to this later. There's a reason why I mentioned that a lot more conceptions happen than there are pregnancies, right? Because if the egg gets fertilized if the egg gets fertilized after it's reached the uterus, then it will start to divide and it will even try to implant, but it won't successfully implant. And so that zygote, fertilized egg, and embryo will be lost. And in vitro fertilization, when things are working well, there will be more embryos than the couple want. So they'll make a judgment about how many embryos to implant, to have at least one stick, and the other embryos stay in a freezer. And as far as we know, they can be kept viable in a frozen state forever. I don't think anyone's worked out how long they can stay frozen and still be viable. This means that in vitro fertilization inevitably results in embryos that nobody wants. And when we talk about abortion, next chapter, one of the things I'll ask you to be thinking about is what should be done with all the embryos that are in, and by now it's probably certainly in the thousands, might be in the hundreds of thousands of embryos stored in various places around the country that are a viable embryo, but that no one wants. It's a great question, and of course there are certain selection parameters that have to do with the apparent health of the embryo, right? How well how far along it is dividing, things like that. There are also companies that will charge you to harvest one of the cells from each of the embryos and do a genetic scan, and in in exchange, if you pay them, they will give you their best guess as to which embryo will have what characteristics. For some characteristics like sex, they're highly accurate. If the Y chromosome's there, you know. If there's no Y chromosome there, you know. But there are also companies out there that I regard as totally shady, who will tell you, they can tell you which embryo is likely to be taller, or which embryo is likely to have blue eyes, or as I talked about in the other class, which embryo is likely to have the highest IQ. And for the most part, they're wrong. So in one study, it's your fault you got me on this. In one study, they looked at the gene scans for human height. So of all the characteristics that humans have, human height, how many of you think that's pretty tightly controlled by genes? Does anyone think genes have nothing to do with that? Right, good. And so scientists have identified at least 100 different genes that affect human height, including some gene sites that make a difference as much as a centimeter, right? And so what some researchers did is said, well, when people are doing gene scans of embryos, how likely are they to be right? So they said, well, let's look at families that have lots of kids, and we'll do a gene scan on all the parents and all the kids. And using gene analysis, we'll predict which sibling should have been the tallest. Everyone get the idea? Because the genes are known, the associations are known, and they know exactly the genotype of the parents and of the kids. And it turns out that the kid that's predicted to be tallest based on gene scan is the tallest a quarter of the time, which means that 3/4 of the time, the prediction is wrong. So my particular bugaboo are those people who will charge you money to predict which kid is going to have the highest IQ. First of all, the association between genes and IQ is nowhere near as strong as between genes and height. And it's a great business model because they can't possibly be proved wrong. They say, oh, pay us a couple $1,000 and we'll tell you that embryo is going to have a higher IQ. So the couple chooses that embryo, raise it up. When it's 13 or 15, they give it an IQ test. And if its IQ is 100, what are they going to do? Go back to the company and say, we want our money back? In which case the company will say, well, the other embryos would have had an even lower IQ than that. Oh, well, you could disprove that. Go take one of the other embryos out of the freezer and have a new kid and wait another 13 years and see if it has a higher or lower IQ, right? So it's a beautiful business model, and you cannot possibly be proven wrong. But in the meantime, you've got the money. And so, to me, it seems a little bit predatory to go to parents who are desperate to have a kid that's healthy, and charge them money to make these predictions. Now, having said that, one place where such testing is really crucial are in those cases where we have identified single gene disorders that have been identified, right? Like Tay-Sachs. or Kennedy's disease, or several other, or Huntington's, where there are lots of embryos there, and you know that dad, say, carries the gene for Huntington's, screening those embryos to only select those that are going to be that are going to have the wild type allele rather than disease allele, that works. That's real. But single gene effects, on human characteristics and behavior, they're rare. Basically, they only fall into two categories: sensory defects like color blindness or deafness, and disasters like Huntington's, where a really bad gene has a gain of function mutation that causes the nervous system to totally break down. But for other things you might care about, including people have wanted to scan for whether the embryo is likely to be gay or straight, or have high IQ, or be tall, things like that. For all those instances, the predictions are very poor. I blame you because, yeah. Ah, is Yeah. So you're saying there's got to be a lot of pressure through natural selection for sperm to be really motile, and I would say, well, surely there's a lot of selective pressure for people to be fertile, and yet 10% of the population isn't. Natural selection does not ensure that every individual in a population will be extremely fit. That's not what Darwin said. What he said is, in every population, there's a lot of variability in fitness, including fertility. Uh-huh. Well, I haven't gotten to ICSI yet, so hold on a second. But yes, so questions about this so far. Another thing that can be done, oh, and that's just a picture of a conceptus. Another thing that can be done, especially if the problem is the father's sperm motility, is gather the eggs, same way we did before, and then look at the eggs in a microscope. And if the father's sperm can't manage to swim to and fertilize the egg in a tube, to actually take the interior of the sperm, lop off the tail, and inject the sperm into an egg under a microscope. So this is known as intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. And as Abder points out, this, this means that you don't really know how motile the sperm would be, but I'm sure when they do these things, they look for the sperm that look the healthiest. Right? They're not going to select a sperm head that has 3 tails attached to it, or one that's looking dead if there are any that are motile there instead. And then you implant the embryo as before, as with IVF. And then when you end up with various conceptuses, you look, as I say, to see those that seem to be dividing properly, where each of the cells seems to be about the same size, because in early embryogenesis, all the cells are about the same size. And I'm sure the other characteristics they look for that they have found over the years indicate that that particular embryo has a chance of making it. One problem with IVF that we mentioned before is multiple births. I don't know if any of you had heard of Octomom, who already had quite a few kids, but through in vitro fertilization, where she was deliberately trying to carry as many kids as possible, delivered 8 babies at once. And there are, anyway, so, and there are several concerns about something like that. So the media focus is, of course, on those minority of cases where there's a happy outcome. And we've known over the years that twins and triplets, that, in general, they are not significantly different from the rest of the population in terms of overall health. But once you get past 3 babies in the same uterus at the same time, there's certain consequences that you can expect. With quadruple, first of all, with twins versus singletons, on average, twins do not weigh as much at birth as singleton. And you can sort of see all sorts of reasons why that might happen. And in general, the more embryos, the more fetuses there are per pregnancy, the smaller the birth weight of each one individually. And if you had to pick one statistic that gives you the best, a statistic that's easy to gather and provides the most prediction about how healthy the baby's going to be the rest of their life, it is birth weight. In general, the higher the birth weight, the less likely they are to have problems later in life. And so once you have a situation where you're increasing the chances of a lot of embryos, then you do have to be more concerned about the health of all the embryos that happen. And in cases of really large births, it's not unusual for first of all, for them to vary somewhat in birth weight. And it's not unusual for at least one of them to have more health problems, to be born smaller and therefore have more difficulty sticking around. So of the stat we have there, 11 high number multiple pregnancies, there were quite a few that were fetuses were stillborn. So the fetus developed, but it was dead when it was delivered. And in other cases, there might be disabilities that last past the first 2 years have happened. So, and you rather than condemn the parents who have IVF and have one of these outcomes, you have to weigh that with the fact that if they decide to have them put in only one embryo, chances are they'll have no babies at all, because nobody can guarantee that every embryo they put in will implant and come to a successful pregnancy. Questions about that? The other thing that IVF has made possible is for women who stopped ovulating a long time ago to have babies well into old age, because even if they've stopped ovulating, the doctors can still give them the fertility drugs and harvest the eggs and fertilize them with sperm from a partner or donor. And so there are folks who have, through that way, have given birth to children at 66 years of age, maybe even 70 years of age. Is this a problem for anyone? Yeah, right. In general, the older one problem here is who's going to look after this kid if the parents are, going to depart pretty soon. Did what? Yeah, Nick? Yeah, in general, there's probably going to be challenges to the mother's health. It's most women. Here's an interesting statistic: is most women who spontaneously can maintain a pregnancy when they're 40, they tend to live long lives, which suggests that they had a good start in life, right? Good genes, good nutrition, not too many parasites, not too many diseases and things like that. And so there's no denying that pregnancy takes its toll. Pramika, Mhm.
So being at that age while the kid is still alive, especially if young kids that need a lot of stimulation to like learn, not fall behind their peers, and like if you're 70, I assume you don't have that much energy, you might have your own health problems to tend to.
Yeah. How? Yeah, we can subsume all that. How effective will the parent will be? Now, of course, speaking of someone who's 71, of course, there are plenty of 70-year-olds who are in excellent health and very energetic, right? But the correlation is almost certainly there. And so, yeah, that's a concern. Uh, as far as I know, I don't know. That's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't remember hearing that that's a thing that happens. And by the way, plenty of women who have IVF, I mean, the reason they're having it is because they've reached 40 and their fertility is declining. Nick, okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, yes. Gee, why are your folks so much older than mine? On the other hand, as someone who was raised by grandparents, right? There are plenty of people out there being raised by their grandparents. That I mean, and and in my era, often the grandparents were, the family would try to pass the grandparents off as the real parents to avoid the stigma of where'd that kid come from exactly, right? So I don't know that that's and I got to tell you, if you have the chance to be raised by doting grandparents, go for it because I thought it was great, right? I highly recommend it. Pardon? Pardon? Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, other, yeah. There was something else about. But the other thing that can sometimes happen with women carrying babies at older age, sometimes it happens because a woman is unable to maintain a successful pregnancy, but her mother volunteers to serve as a surrogate mother. And her mother, of course, is going to be elderly. And so they might harvest the egg from the daughter, sperm from her partner, and then implant in mom. And in that case, I don't see any ethical problem with that. Mom knows the risks. The everyone else knows the risks. And so, yeah, sometimes that works out well. We'll get later to having the surrogate mother not be mom, but be a stranger, someone that you're paying. We'll get that. That's a different situation. We'll get there in a moment. Questions about that? Yeah. Sophie? Pardon? It's a great question. Would a physician say, no, I'm not going to do that for you because I think you're too old? Tricky situation. Always the chance of a lawsuit, I suppose, of the parents saying, well, you have to. But my guess is parents in that situation, potential parent, they would just go to another practitioner, right? Another clinic, stuff like that. It's a great, yeah. I would think that doctors would have the option of saying, I think that the risk of complication is too high there, and therefore I'll not do it. I think that's quite common actually. So I'll bet that happens. Good. So we talked about causes of male infertility, different things that can cause female infertility. Perhaps the most common is pelvic inflammatory disease. So things that cause some sort of infection that causes swelling, edema in the reproductive tract, and where it can really, one thing that can happen is if the oviduct is sufficiently swollen that the egg can't get out or can't get out in a timely fashion, then that can lead to problems. In other cases, it's endometriosis, where the lining of the uterus, there's too much of it, and maybe some of it is outside the uterus, but it's actually in the oviduct, and therefore the endometrium growing there can impair the egg getting out. Then there's amenorrhea, where there's no menses taking place. Several things the primary amenorrhea is when the woman's never had a period, and there are both genetic and medical reasons that might cause that to start. It's called secondary amenorrhea if they were cycling for a while and then they stop. And there are lots of things that can cause a woman who's been cycling before to stop cycling. Among the things that are well known and well documented is weight loss. If there's a clear correlation that if a woman loses, quite a bit of weight, that may cause her to stop cycling. And you can see how natural selection would have favored that sort of thing. If you're not getting your next meal, this is a terrible time, or there's nothing to be gained by trying to get pregnant now because neither you nor the baby are likely to make it. Also, exercise. Some women, exercise excessively. It's sometimes a problem for Olympic athletes who are so busy training that they will put their body under enough stress that sometimes that causes them to stop cycling. And there are various drugs that can cause, that can interfere with cycling. And in terms of Olympic athletes, I will say back in that era before you were born, when the East German women's swim team basically always came away with all the medals, it was clear the reason they were doing that is because they were being given anabolic steroids by the East German government. And one of the things that will do, taking anabolic steroids, like taking the pill, will stop ovulation. Right? No ovulation, no menses. Questions? Yeah, good. You saw something about male infertility? Oh, and chewing tobacco. Yeah, I haven't. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, in general, you know, drugs for the most part don't help any physiological process, including spermatogenesis. So I didn't know that, but doesn't strike me as shocking. And you're saying specifically chewing tobacco, not smoking. Yeah. Okay. For women, I presume so. I mean, certainly we know lots of different drugs can interfere with ovulation. So I don't know how many women chew tobacco outside the Ozarks, but I certainly grew up knowing women who chewed tobacco. But there you are. Yeah, sorry. And and for the most part, women who don't cycle, even if there's no evidence of stress and no evidence um, of drugs, and the body weight is fine, it is usually it's described as idiopathic, which is just a technical term meaning it happens spontaneously and we have no idea why it's happening. My joke is it's called idiopathic because it means we're idiots. We don't really understand as much as we think we did. Some of the drugs that can interfere with ovulation, like the birth control pills, etc. So usually birth control pills consist of estrogen. One of the things that can happen are estrogen antagonists, like tamoxifen and things like that, often block estrogen receptors in the brain, and so they stop the negative feedback loop. And for whatever reason, the brain detects that reduction in circulating estrogen, and so it releases more GnRH. And so this can then be used to trigger ovulation. And when that happens, the pituitary is releasing more FSH and may prime for ovulation. So most of the fertility drugs that are given to in vitro fertilization, often they are, in fact, they could be gonadotropins or synthetic gonadotropins, or it turns out gonadotropin antagonists can also, or estrogen antagonists can also be used. And here is a fact of life that I referred to before, is that in general, for most women, there is a biological clock that if they're going to have children, that if they reach the age of 40 and they haven't had a child yet, it's going to be much more difficult on average for them to get pregnant than it was before. And so in an age where more and more women have careers and where more and more careers require a lot of commitment in terms of work and academia, the particular concern is those women who don't want to have a pregnancy until they reach tenure, and yet they may not achieve tenure until they're in their mid-30s, and there may or may not be enough time for them to be pregnant thereafter. So this is the age at marriage and the percentage that stay childless. It tends to be high. And many of the women who aren't childless, it's because they're using in vitro fertilization and stuff like that. The other trend that's happening in the United States is that in general, the more education women have, the later they are, the longer they wait to have their children. And some of this, of course, is just access to an understanding of and acceptance of contraception. But in this very complicated graph here, you're looking at the ages of various women and um, and the percentage of them that have children. And so in general, if they have some college, they are later, older in life before they have, pardon me, if they have some college, bachelor's degrees, they tend to be older in life to have their first child than women who have a high school education or GED. Among women that stop education after high school, it's somewhat bimodal. Some get pregnant right away, others use contraception, et cetera, as you'd expect. But in general, there is this idea that women who are pursuing higher education may wait until they're older to get pregnant. But of course, plenty of 30-year-old women have offspring, right? And the other trend that we've talked about several times is women just don't have as many pregnancies these days as they used to. So there was a time in the 1850s when women on average would have 5 or 6 offspring. And many of you come from families where that was the case. And the number has gone down consistently. What's happening there in 1950? Around 1950, why is there that jump? Yeah, Sophie, pardon? Yeah, so the end of World War II, when the United States, this is the US, had a big, so these are the baby boomers, right? Me among them, right? That's why there was this big jump in the number of babies, increase in the number, in the sizes of school districts, things like that. And it's been pretty much downhill ever since, with lots of consequences for plenty of you. Okay. So the fact that there are fewer and fewer, that women are having fewer babies, brings up the question of what population growth is going to be like. And you've all been told repeatedly how there's been a huge spike in the size of the human population on Earth. And what I like about this graph is it goes all the way back to the Stone Age, where estimates are there were about 10,000 human beings total in the whole world. And even in ancient times, there weren't that many. Or you look at the year 0, about 2,000 years ago, there might have been 190 million people all over the world. And there's this huge increase, clearly a geometric progression, right? Where these days they're saying, I mean, so we're now past, we're going to go past the 10 billion mark. So here's about where I think we are now. Yeah, about 8 billion. And we're eventually going to get to the 10 billion mark. That's the projection, et cetera. And yet, how is that happening when women are having fewer children each? Well, first of all, those stats about how many children women have, that happens to be for the United States, and there's a lot more to the world than that. But there are at least some demographers who are thinking that we have hit our peak, that we're going to hit our peak soon. So in some cases, they're suggesting that in 2086, and some of you will be here for that coming 2086, that in fact, population will start to decline. And here they're looking at the growth rate. And as the growth rate declines, there's going to be an asymptoting of the number of people that are around. And I didn't include it here, But some people think that the peak might be as soon as 2050, not 2086, and that's certainly in your lifetime. And the predictions are that population will go down just as precipitously as it went up. Is anyone worried about that? Would that be a bad thing? If the world population went back to 500 million or so? Discuss. How many people think that's something to be alarmed about? By the way, plenty of governments around the world are alarmed about this, right? In China right now, and why is China concerned about the fact that there aren't that many young people today? Yeah. Say it again, louder. Yeah. Like most countries, they've got this swelling population of old people, and who's going to take care of them? And we have so many old people because, of course, medicine has gotten so good. And so China, which for years in my lifetime had a one-child policy where it was a crime if a couple had more than one child, they're trying desperately to come up with incentives to get people to have more than one child. And it's not working. Nothing they have proposed has actually changed the birth rate. So, and there are people in the United States that are concerned about birth rates, especially in some cases among certain portions of our population more than others. And what incentives would work? Yeah. Yeah. Make it cheaper. I mean, we've talked about this before. The number one thing, because Sophie knows it, the number one way to encourage people to have more children? Yeah. Not one that hasn't been tried and is probably never going to be offered. Your opinion might be gun control. Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't expected that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. Riley? Money is good for a lot of things. And so if so if they said, well, we'll give you $20,000 to have a baby this year, do you think that would persuade many people? Might some, but you're going to have expenses a lot more than 1 year, right? Yeah. You want, I mean, in a economy where both folks have to work, both parents have to work to be able to financially make it. If you really want to encourage people to have children, start offering free childcare. Yeah. Say it louder. No, you'll have to say it some more. Louder. Job security would be great. Yeah. Uh, right. I mean, avoiding a recession would be good, but so we're not in a recession now. Are our families doing okay economically? Yeah. Okay. Oh my, you let me get past time. All right, off you go. See you next time. Sorry about that.